Her silence was not born out of weakness, but most in the village never cared to see it that way. From the time she was small, she had learned that words often caused more harm than good. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet strength, one that lived in the way she endured hardship, in the way she never raised her hand to strike back, and in the way her kindness seemed to bloom even in the harshest conditions. Her days began before the sun itself stretched its golden arms across the horizon. She fetched water from the stream, balanced carefully in her small hands, and tended to the small garden outside her hut. Even when her stepfamily heaped endless chores upon her, she bore them without complaint, letting her silence speak in ways words never could. She had a way of softening burdens for others while carrying her own as if they weighed nothing. Many who saw her mistook her gentleness for frailty. The children of the village laughed when they saw her move quietly among the elders, offering them food or helping them walk when their legs failed them. The women gossiped about her, whispering that no man would ever want a girl who could not shout, argue, or boast of her worth. The young men smirked, calling her a ghost in daylight, too timid to matter, too silent to ever rise above the dust on her feet. But she did not flinch at their mockery. She would simply lower her gaze, her lips forming the faintest smile, and continue her work as though their words were nothing more than wind blowing across her skin. What they saw as weakness was, in truth, a kind of endurance none of them could imagine. Her silence was not emptiness but a vessel filled with observation. She noticed what others ignored: the cracks in the ground that revealed a thirsty earth, the tired way a mother's hands trembled after grinding grain all day, the loneliness in the old man's eyes when no one came to sit by his fire. She responded with action, not words. She would gather extra water and pour it gently at the roots of a wilting tree. She would leave a small portion of her meal at a neighbor's doorstep. She would pause to carry a bundle of firewood for someone who struggled. These small acts of kindness were her language, a silent declaration that though she spoke little, she understood much. The villagers, blind in their arrogance, took advantage of her nature. They asked her to do more than her share, knowing she would not refuse. She fetched, carried, and cleaned until her body ached, yet not once did she protest. Some believed she was too simple-minded to resist, too meek to stand for herself. But there were others, very few, who caught glimpses of something deeper. The elder woman who often found her doorstep swept clean without asking, the child who discovered a piece of fruit left secretly beside her mat, the sick man who received water when no one else cared to bring it. These few began to understand that her silence was not weakness. It was power wrapped in humility. Still, for most, her quietness was a target. When the girls of her age danced at festivals, laughing and calling for attention, she stood at the edges, her head bowed, her smile small and unassuming. They mocked her for never raising her voice, for never stepping into the circle of light where the drummers played. "She is too afraid of her own shadow," one sneered. "She has no spirit," another added. Each laugh was sharp, each whisper cruel, but she carried them with the same unshaken calm. She hurt, she did not show it. Instead, she drew strength from the earth beneath her feet, from the steady rhythm of her breath, from the knowledge that storms could rage, but silence endured long after thunder faded. Her stepmother in particular despised her quiet defiance. No matter how much scolding or striking was done, the girl never retaliated, never cried out. It was as though her silence swallowed pain and turned it into something unbreakable. This unsettled her tormentors more than any words could. They wanted her to scream, to beg, to crumble into the dust. But she refused to give them that satisfaction. She bent like a reed under the weight of their cruelty, but like the reed, she never broke. In her heart, she believed that the earth itself saw her suffering, that it carried her pain deep into its soil and would one day answer for her. This quiet resilience became her shield. When laughter stung her ears, she reminded herself that laughter was fleeting. When mockery cut like knives, she trusted that wounds of the spirit healed stronger than wounds of the flesh. Her gentleness, mocked so often, was not a burden but a gift. She understood that anger consumed itself quickly, but patience endured. And so, while others shouted, she listened. While others struck, she healed. While others mocked, she endured. Over time, this balance shaped her into something rare. She learned to find peace in silence, to see beauty where others saw only struggle. She knew the song of the river at dawn, the whisper of trees when the wind shifted, the way stars blinked brighter just before the moon disappeared. These details, unnoticed by those who filled their lives with noise, became her secret strength. Her silence was alive, a companion that guided her through darkness, a force that kept her spirit steady even when the world tried to bend it. Though she did not know it yet, this silent strength was more powerful than the villagers' laughter, more enduring than the cruelty of her stepmother, and more unyielding than the stones beneath her feet. In her humility, in her patience, in her quiet resilience, she was already becoming something greater than anyone could see. Her silence was not the silence of fear, it was the silence of the earth itself, waiting for the right moment to rise. Her days were filled with quiet acts of care, yet every gesture seemed to stoke the jealousy that simmered in the hearts of those around her. Her stepmother and step-siblings watched the way neighbors admired her patience when fetching water or her willingness to share food even when her own stomach growled with hunger. This quiet grace, instead of being celebrated in her household, became a thorn in their eyes. They whispered to one another that she was pretending, that her kindness was a trick to make herself look better than them. Every soft smile she offered was twisted into arrogance, every act of compassion reshaped into a performance meant to shame them. Such thoughts did not arise from truth but from envy, and envy has a way of taking root deep in the soil of the heart until it chokes out all reason. It began with small slights. When food was distributed at home, she was given the smallest portions. When chores were divided, hers were always heavier and more thankless than the rest. The villagers, too, caught the whispers of her stepfamily and added to them, saying that no girl who stayed so quiet could be trusted. Some muttered that silence was not a virtue but a mask for cunning. Others said she was too fragile to be of use, that her gentleness was a flaw in a world that demanded hard hands and sharp tongues. Slowly, the perception of her goodness turned to a curse. The village children taunted her as she carried pots on her head, calling her weak, saying the earth itself would crack beneath her if she dared to demand anything for herself. Her stepmother fueled these cruel seeds with constant comparisons. "Look at her," she would say to the others. "She is like a shadow taking from our home but giving nothing. Too soft, too silent, too useless." And the words grew sharper with each passing day, until even those outside the household repeated them as if they were truths carved into stone. Her stepsister, who resented how some elders secretly admired the girl's patience, took special joy in humiliating her in public. At the market, she would push her aside and laugh loudly, declaring to anyone listening that her sister was too slow, too clumsy, too delicate to belong among hard-working villagers. Laughter followed, and the girl bore it with lowered eyes and a quiet heart, though each jeer pierced her deeply. But cruelty is never satisfied with words alone. It grows restless, hungry for action. When storms passed and the family fields were left flooded, her stepfamily sent her alone to drain the water and restore the crops, a task too great for one girl. When she stumbled home, exhausted and bruised, she was greeted not with sympathy but with mocking laughter and accusations that she had not worked hard enough. The villagers, hearing such things, repeated them until they became part of her identity. "She is weak," they said. "She is less than the rest of us." And soon, the girl found herself treated not as one of their own but as something beneath them. Someone to shoulder burdens, someone to mock, someone to remind them of their own supposed strength. She endured it all with silence. Each insult, each cruelty, each unfair weight placed upon her shoulders became another layer she carried in her heart. But while they thought they were breaking her, something else was happening, something none of them could see. For just as seeds of cruelty were being planted in the hearts of her stepfamily and neighbors, seeds of resilience were being planted in her. Their taunts forced her to dig deeper into her well of strength. Their mockery taught her patience sharper than any blade. Their attempts to strip her of dignity only carved it deeper into her soul. They believed they were diminishing her, but in truth, they were preparing her for a moment none of them could imagine. A moment when the very earth beneath their feet would remember every tear, every insult, every burden laid upon her and rise in response. And so, the cruelty continued, thriving like weeds that choke a garden. They thought they had made her less than human. They did not yet realize they had made her something more. The day of cruelty began under the sun that bore down mercilessly, as though it too conspired with the hearts of the villagers. Whispers had been swirling for weeks, each word like a thorn meant to cut deeper into the quiet girl's fleshless strength. Her silence, her gentleness, her refusal to answer insult with insult, all had become reasons for hatred. In a world where noise equaled power, her calmness was mistaken for frailty. The jealousy that simmered in her stepfamily's hearts now spread like smoke through the villagers until it became a wildfire. That morning it was decided, unspoken yet clear, that they would break her. Not through words, not through whispers, but with the cruelty of their hands. She was carrying water from the stream, her steps steady though the gourd on her head weighed heavily. Dust clung to her bare feet, her simple wrap was faded, and yet, to those watching, there was something about her that made them feel small. It was not wealth, it was not beauty in the boastful sense, but a light that came from somewhere deeper, something she herself seemed unaware of. That light mocked them. That light made them angry. When she passed by the gathering in the village square, her stepmother's voice was the first to cut through the air like a whip. There she goes, pretending to be strong while hiding her weakness. She thinks silence makes her better than us. The crowd laughed, some joining in to throw jabs, others spitting into the dirt. But today the insults did not end with words. One of the men stepped forward, emboldened by the sneers of others. He snatched the gourd from her head, letting it crash to the ground, spilling water into the thirsty earth. She bent to pick it up, not raising her eyes, not speaking, but her calmness enraged them more. Another shoved her shoulder, sending her staggering. Murmurs rose. See how weak she is? She does not even defend herself. She is no better than the dirt beneath our feet. Her stepbrother's hand came down across her face, and the sharp crack of the slap echoed. The girl swayed, still silent. But then it began. They descended on her as though she were not human but a shadow to be beaten away. First the step family, then the villagers, each eager to prove their strength by crushing what they thought was fragile. She fell to her knees, her arms trying only to shield her head, not to strike back. Feet kicked her ribs, hands clawed her hair, fists slammed against her frail body. Dust rose around them like a storm, coating her skin, her blood mixing with the soil in dark smears. They did not see her as a daughter, as a sister, as one of their own. They saw her as the silence they feared, the gentleness they despised. Her breathing grew shallow as the blows rained down. The world spun, a haze of dust and pain, and her body crumpled under the weight of their violence. She collapsed fully into the earth, her cheek pressed into the dirt, her arms limp. Her eyes fluttered shut as consciousness slipped away, and still the crowd circled, some laughing, others quiet but complicit. To them she was defeated. To them she was no longer a threat, only a body lying still on the ground, small and powerless. The earth beneath her was warm, not from the sun alone, but from something older, something alive. Her body sank into it as though the soil itself reached to cradle her, softening the hardness of the ground. Her breath slowed, dust filling her lungs, but the earth held her in a strange embrace, as if it knew her suffering, as if it had been waiting for her. The villagers, seeing her unmoving form, stepped back, satisfied with their work. Her stepmother spat beside her head, her stepbrother kicked the last of the dust onto her back, and the crowd dispersed, leaving her broken body behind as though she were nothing. But in the silence that followed, the earth stirred. It was subtle, unnoticed by those who left, but felt by the unconscious girl. Her body, lying still, was not lying in defeat but in communion. The soil whispered beneath her skin, the ground hummed with a strength older than cruelty. Where they saw collapse, the earth saw connection. Her silence had never been weakness, it was an echo of the ground itself, patient, enduring, waiting. And though she did not yet wake, though her body was battered and her mind lost in darkness, the dust that covered her was not only dirt. It was the touch of something ancient rising to meet her pain. The village believed they had broken her. But the earth on which they had thrown her down, had just begun to rise beneath her. The earth had long been quiet, keeping the secrets of the village buried beneath its surface, but when her body fell limp into the dust, something shifted. The ground quivered softly at first, almost imperceptible, as if it were sighing in grief for what it had witnessed. The villagers stood back, half in fear and half in confusion, staring at the girl who lay motionless. Her face, smudged with soil, looked peaceful in unconsciousness, yet her stillness unsettled them. Then came another tremor, stronger this time, rattling the bowls and calabashes left outside nearby huts, sending ripples through the pools of water collected in clay jars. Children clutched their mothers' skirts, while the men tried to steady themselves, their voices cracking with unease. Something ancient had been disturbed. Beneath her fragile form, the earth stirred as though alive. A crack formed in the ground, not violent but deliberate, circling around her body like a protective ring. Out of the fissures, roots began to emerge, twisting upward with astonishing speed. They were tender yet strong, their tips glowing faintly as if carrying the heartbeat of the earth itself. The roots curved around her like protective arms, wrapping her in a cradle made of soil and vine. Dust, once a symbol of shame where she had been struck down, rose like a gentle blanket and settled over her like a soft shroud. To the villagers, it looked as if the land had chosen her, claimed her, and was now holding her as a mother holds a wounded child. The murmurs began to rise. "This is witchcraft," one whispered, though his voice trembled, betraying his own disbelief. Another shook his head violently, insisting, "No, this is the anger of the ancestors. They see what we have done." The stepmother, whose jealousy had fueled much of the cruelty, stumbled backward, her face drained of all color. She had expected the girl to die quietly, forgotten in the dust, not to be lifted up by the very ground they all depended on for their survival. Her sons shifted uneasily, their bravado broken by the trembling earth beneath their bare feet. The tremors did not stop. Instead, the ground seemed to breathe, pulsing beneath them in slow, deliberate waves, as though it had awoken from a long sleep. Grass sprouted in patches where the soil had cracked, and wildflowers forced themselves up with sudden urgency, blooming in colors brighter than the villagers had ever seen. It was as though nature itself had chosen this moment to declare its allegiance. The girl's unconscious body was elevated slightly, her chest rising and falling faintly, showing that life had not left her. She was no longer lying discarded in the dirt. She was being carried, lifted by something greater than human hands. Those watching were struck with awe and terror in equal measure. Some fell to their knees, fearing they had offended forces too great to name. Others tried to flee, but their feet sank into the soil as if the earth demanded they stay and witness what they had done. The silence was broken only by the soft groaning of shifting roots and the occasional gasp of a villager who could no longer deny that they were standing on sacred ground. The girl, though unconscious, seemed to be breathing in rhythm with the earth. With every rise of her chest, the roots tightened protectively around her, and with every exhale, dust swirled gently into the air, forming patterns that looked almost like whispers carried on the wind. The villagers began to realize that her suffering was not her own alone. It had awakened something much older, something that had always been watching. The earth was not passive, it was alive, responsive, and it had chosen to rise in defense of the one they had cast aside. A strange peace settled over the scene, mingled with dread. Even the animals of the village seemed to respond. Goats that had been bleating moments before grew silent, and birds landed on branches nearby, watching with unblinking eyes. It was as if the entire world paused to honor the bond between the girl and the ground that cradled her. The stepmother's lips trembled as she muttered excuses, trying to convince herself and others that this was unnatural, that it must be evil. But deep down she felt it, the undeniable truth that the girl she had scorned was not weak, not helpless. She was connected to something the stepmother could never control. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, its rays caught the dust still rising from the soil, making it glow golden around the girl's body. To the villagers it was no longer just dust, it was light, a halo formed from the land itself. The fear in their hearts grew heavier, for they now understood that this child they had mocked and beaten was bound to the earth in a way none of them could comprehend. She had been silent, yes, but her silence had spoken to the deepest roots of creation, and the earth had answered. By the time night began to creep over the village, the tremors had softened into a steady hum beneath their feet, like a heartbeat echoing through the soil. The roots still held her gently, and the villagers could no longer look away. Something sacred had been born out of cruelty, and though they did not yet know it, their lives, and the fate of their village, would never be the same again. The villagers had barely begun to celebrate their cruelty when the ground beneath their feet shifted again. This time it was not a trembling of warning but a deliberate, rising motion, as though the very soil had taken breath and decided to act. Dust curled upward in slow spirals, roots loosened themselves from their buried depths, and the earth that had cradled her broken form began to lift. At first, the people thought it was some strange trick of the wind, but soon they realized, no wind had such strength, no breeze could hold a body so tenderly. It was the land itself, rising like a parent from slumber, bearing her weight upon its patient shoulders. Her body, once lying limp and lifeless against the dust, began to ascend. Slowly, steadily, as though the earth feared to break what little of her remained, it carried her upward. A hush fell over the crowd that had moments ago roared with laughter. Every eye was drawn to her, every hand stilled, every jeer caught in the throat. Children clung to their mothers' skirts, men gripped their walking sticks as if something holy had risen before them, and even her stepmother, whose malice had long burned hotter than fire, felt her knees weaken. The villagers watched in disbelief as the girl hovered above them, her hair spilling downward like a dark river, her arms loose at her sides, her face pale yet serene. Around her, a faint glow began to appear, subtle at first, like moonlight through mist. But as the earth raised her higher, that glow brightened until it seemed her wounds themselves were the source of light. Where bruises had marred her skin, golden warmth spread like dawn chasing away shadows. Cuts shimmered and closed, leaving behind faint trails of radiance. Every lash of cruelty, every blow struck upon her body, was undone by a power that did not belong to men. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some villagers dropped to the ground, pressing their foreheads into the soil they had scorned moments earlier. Others stumbled backward, shielding their eyes as if her presence had become too much to bear. A few whispered frantic prayers, certain they had unleashed wrath from the spirits of the earth, while others simply stood frozen, unable to reconcile the girl they had mocked with the figure that now hovered above them like an answered prophecy. Her stepbrother, who had been the first to strike her, tried to laugh, tried to declare it some strange trick. But his voice cracked in his throat. He saw what the others saw, the earth itself obeying her presence, the dust clinging to her like a veil of reverence, and the roots curling gently around her arms and legs as though to steady her ascent. This was no deception. This was no child's trick. It was power, pure, ancient, undeniable. And though she remained silent, though her lips did not part to utter a single word, the message rang louder than thunder in every villager's mind. Her silence was no weakness. It had never been emptiness. It was the stillness of the deep earth, waiting, enduring, holding strength beyond measure. The girl they had struck down had not fallen to weakness, she had fallen to rise greater than any of them could imagine. Higher and higher she rose, until she was above their heads, the sun catching her figure and setting her in a brilliance almost too bright to look upon. Her eyes opened, and though they carried no anger, no vengeance, their depth was enough to make the guilty tremble. In them lay the reflection of all the pain she had suffered, but also something greater: mercy, patience, and the quiet strength of one who bore no malice even in the face of cruelty. The earth did not roar. It did not demand vengeance. Instead, it lifted her gently, lovingly, as a mother might raise a child above the grasp of those who would harm it. And in that gentle act lay the truest form of judgment. The villagers had revealed their cruelty by striking her, but the earth revealed its truth by lifting her, by declaring before all, "This one is mine. This one is chosen. This one you cannot break." As she hovered there, her wounds glowing brighter and brighter, a breeze passed through the village, soft, fragrant, carrying the scent of fresh soil after rain. It wrapped around her like a cloak, stirring her hair, carrying whispers no one could quite hear. Some swore later that the wind carried words in a language older than memory, words that seemed to bless her, to mark her as something beyond mortal suffering. The villagers could no longer look away. Their shame burned hotter than their earlier cruelty, for now they saw her not as weak, not as fragile, but as a vessel of the very earth they trod upon daily without thought. And they knew, deep in their hearts, that their actions had not merely been against a girl. They had been against the soil that fed them, against the roots that held their homes, against the dust from which their ancestors had been shaped. And still she remained silent. She did not curse them. She did not accuse. She did not even reach out her hand to strike. Instead, she floated above them, her presence a mirror in which they could see their own ugliness. Her silence had become their condemnation, her resilience their undoing, her ascent their humiliation. For as long as they lived, none of them would forget the sight. The girl they mocked, lifted high by the earth itself, her body glowing with light, her wounds becoming wonders, her silence louder than any shout. In that moment they knew that no cruelty could ever break her again. The crowd that had gathered to watch her humiliation could no longer move or speak. What had begun as a spectacle of cruelty, her fragile frame beaten into the dirt, had twisted into something they could not comprehend. The same earth they trampled daily, the soil they believed beneath them, now rose with a will of its own to protect her. As she hovered above them, her body glowing with an otherworldly light, the villagers who had raised their hands against her felt a sudden weight pull them down. At first, they thought it was exhaustion from the violence they had unleashed. Their arms drooped, their knees buckled. But when they tried to straighten, their limbs betrayed them. The soil beneath their feet seemed to grip them like shackles, refusing to release. Terror swept through them. One man, who had been among the first to strike her, attempted to flee. But his legs felt as though iron weights had been tied to them. Each step sank him deeper into the ground, until the earth held him at his ankles. He screamed, clawing at the soil, but it clung tighter the more he fought. The villagers stared, their hearts thundering. The punishment was not from any hand they could see, it was from the ground itself. The women who had sneered at her grace, who whispered venom into the ears of their men, now covered their mouths in horror. They too began to feel the heaviness spread through their bodies. Their fingers stiffened, their feet grew rooted where they stood, as though the earth had decided who was guilty and who would not move again. The children of the village wailed and clung to their mothers' skirts, but the women could not even bend to hold them. Fear was not just in their limbs, it was in their eyes, in their chests, in their breath. For the first time they realized the land they had called theirs had never belonged to them. They were squatters on a living body that could judge and retaliate. Above them, she floated in silence, her head bowed as if in sleep, her hair spread out like dark threads weaving into the wind. The glow around her body was not harsh but soft, yet to the guilty it burned brighter than the sun. Her wounds, once raw and torn, now gleamed with light that looked like veins of gold traveling across her skin. A woman from the step family, the stepmother who had led the whispers of hate, tried to cry out for forgiveness. Her voice cracked, but the earth drank her words before they could travel. The soil at her feet climbed higher, creeping up her calves like slow but deliberate vines. She shrieked and struggled, but the more she resisted, the more the ground held her still. Her cruelty, planted long ago, had ripened into her own snare. The villagers looked at one another with wide, panicked eyes. None dared to speak aloud what they were thinking, but every heart whispered the same realization. They had raised their hands against one chosen by the earth, and the earth had now turned against them. The men who had struck the hardest felt the greatest burden. Their arms became useless weights dangling from their shoulders, their backs bent as though invisible stones pressed down on them. Their faces pressed toward the dust, their breath filled with grit. Every inhalation was a reminder of the soil's power. It could choke, it could bind, it could consume. They who had once pushed her face into the dirt with laughter, now tasted the bitterness of that same dust forced upon them. Whispers spread through the crowd, broken and trembling. She is not like us. The ground belongs to her. We have angered the spirits of the land. These words, though hushed, carried louder than any drum. Even those who had not touched her but had watched silently were struck with dread. Their feet, though not bound as tightly as the guilty, felt unsteady. They could not take a step forward to help her, nor could they step back to escape the sight. They were trapped in the in-between, weighed down by their own complicity. The children, innocent in their lack of choice, were the only ones the earth spared. They wailed, confused by their parents' immobility, but their small feet could still move freely. They darted about, their cries echoing like sharp birdsong against the silence of the frozen adults. It was as though the land wanted them to witness, to remember, to grow up with the lesson carved into their hearts. Cruelty has roots that the earth itself will rip out. Above all, silence pressed heavy on the village. The usual rustle of trees, the buzz of insects, the murmur of voices, all had stilled. It was as though the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for judgment to fall. Then slowly her eyes opened. They were not the eyes of a beaten girl anymore. They shimmered with the deep, endless hues of soil after rain, dark, rich, alive. She looked down at those who had harmed her, and they quaked under her gaze. They could not meet her eyes, for in them they saw not vengeance but truth. The truth of their wickedness laid bare like roots torn from the earth. Her lips did not move, but the ground beneath them trembled with a voice. It was not her voice alone, but the voice of the land itself, deep and resonant. Those who strike the innocent strike against me, and I reject them. The guilty shrieked, trying to cover their ears, but the words rang inside their bones. They could not escape them. The sound was not outside, it was within. Those who had been heaviest sank deeper, their knees swallowed by soil. Their strength, once used to harm, drained away like water spilled on dry ground. They begged for mercy, but mercy was far from them. The fear of the wicked had become complete. No weapon, no strength, no number of voices could save them now. They were at the mercy of the same earth they had spat upon. And all the while she floated higher, no longer unconscious, no longer broken. She was the child of the soil, and the soil itself had risen to declare her untouchable. The air grew still after the earth had lifted her, as though the world itself paused to listen. The villagers who had moments before been shouting and jeering, now stood in uneasy silence, their eyes darting between one another, searching for an explanation. Then, faint at first, came the sound of whispers carried on the wind. They drifted low, curling around the huts and trees, circling the gathering like smoke that had no fire. The whispers were not in the voice of any man or woman, yet everyone could hear them, threading into their ears like secrets too old to be spoken aloud. Some clutched their chests in fear, while others covered their ears, but it made no difference. The words sank through skin and bone, lodging themselves in the heart. They were not in a single tongue but carried a rhythm every soul understood. The voices spoke of the girl lying cradled in the arms of the earth, declaring her not weak, not forsaken, but chosen. Chosen to rise where others had fallen, chosen to bear the strength of the soil and the dust, chosen to silence cruelty with the voice of the spirits themselves. The villagers shivered as the whispers grew louder, turning into a chant that rolled across the sky. Women clutched their children close, while the men who had raised their hands against her felt as if unseen eyes were watching them. The dust at their feet began to stir, circling in small spirals, lifting tiny stones that rattled against one another like teeth chattering. It was as though the very ground beneath them had awakened not only to hold the girl but also to pass judgment upon those who had wronged her. The elders who had spent lifetimes telling tales of old, knew this sound. Their faces blanched as memories stirred, memories of stories passed from one fire to another, of ancient ones whose whispers carried truth sharper than any spear. One elder, trembling, muttered that the spirits of the land spoke only when the balance of life had been broken. Another whispered back that perhaps the girl's silence had been sacred all along, not weakness but a vessel for the unseen to dwell. Their words spread through the crowd like wildfire, and unease hardened into dread. Above them, the girl's body glowed faintly where her wounds had been, not with fire but with the soft golden light of healing soil. The roots still curled around her like tender arms, holding her aloft. As the whispers rushed faster through the air, her hair lifted in the wind, her silence now heavy with power. Though her lips did not part, the spirits spoke through her stillness, and all knew their message was clear: she was not theirs to break. The wicked men who had struck her stumbled backward, their breath shallow, their throats dry. Their hands tingled as though fire ants crawled under their skin, and their feet dragged as if chains bound them to the earth. They looked at their palms and saw dust clinging stubbornly, refusing to shake free, marking them in shame before their entire village. For the first time their boldness faltered, their power stripped bare by whispers they could not fight. Some of the villagers, ashamed, sank to their knees, covering their faces. Others began to wail, begging forgiveness, though none dared address the girl directly. They spoke to the air, to the spirits, to the earth that now seemed alive. Still the voices did not soften. They roared through the trees, echoed in the riverbanks, and hummed in the very bones of the ground. Every word carried a warning: this was no ordinary girl. The animals of the land seemed to hear it too. Birds rose in flocks from the trees, their cries echoing the chant. Dogs howled and pawed at the earth, sensing a power that shook their instincts. Even the cattle in the fields turned their heads toward the village, restless, stamping the ground. It was as though all creation bore witness to the girl's unveiling, her silent resilience now revealed as divine strength. The girl remained suspended, her body slowly rising higher as the wind swirled beneath her. Her eyes, still closed, gave her the look of someone sleeping in peace, untouched by fear. Yet her presence pressed heavy upon everyone, like a weight on the chest, demanding reverence. The whispers twisted around her form, not chaotic but harmonious, as if 1,000 ancestors had joined voices to crown her spirit. A hush fell so deep it seemed the world itself had stopped breathing. Then, clear as thunder cracking over mountains, one voice broke through the chorus, older and stronger than all the rest. It declared that silence had always been her shield, her humility her weapon, her kindness her proof. Where the villagers saw weakness, the earth saw a vessel worthy of carrying its voice. And so, the spirit proclaimed, she would walk henceforth not as the mocked, but as the chosen child of dust and soil. The wicked men fell to the ground, trembling, their bodies pressed flat as though gravity had grown heavier just for them. Their mouths opened but no sound came, only choked gasps as if the earth had stolen their voices in punishment for mocking hers. The crowd stared in awe, and whispers spread among them that the ground itself had rejected their cruelty. Then the wind calmed, though the voices lingered faintly, echoing into the distance. The girl descended slowly, lowered by the roots until her feet touched the earth once more. But she did not stumble or fall. She stood upright, her face serene, her silence now vast as the sky above. No wound marked her body, no bruise stained her skin. The earth had not only healed her, it had claimed her as its child. The villagers, humbled, bowed their heads. Some wept, some prayed, some dared not lift their eyes. The girl said nothing, but her stillness spoke louder than words ever could. The spirits had given her their voice, and through it she had been raised above cruelty. The earth would now walk with her, every step echoing the whispers of the unseen. And from that day, none could mock her silence again. For in her quiet stood the strength of ages, and in her gentleness dwelled the might of the earth itself. The transformation. The earth did not simply cradle her anymore, it began to reshape her. Slowly, as though a sculptor's unseen hands worked upon her body, the girl's frail frame grew radiant. The villagers, who had once beaten her without mercy, now stared in silence as the soil that had embraced her began to glow faintly, its dust shimmering like golden grains caught in dawn's first light. Her hair, once tangled and dull from years of hardship, lifted gently in the breeze. But it was no ordinary hair anymore. It glimmered as if woven with threads of earth itself, each strand carrying flecks of rich soil, sparkling like tiny gemstones. It was as though the very ground had claimed her as its daughter, adorning her with its deepest treasures. Her skin, marked earlier with bruises and wounds, now shone with an otherworldly radiance, resembling clay kissed by the morning sun after a cleansing rain. She looked both human and something more, as though she was formed anew by the heart of the earth. Gasps rippled among the villagers. Some whispered in awe, others trembled in fear. For years they had mocked her silence, thinking her powerless, but now her silence had transformed into something far greater, an anticipation, a weight heavier than any word. When at last she opened her lips, the air itself seemed to shiver. Her voice emerged, not soft, not timid, but deep and resonant, carrying an echo like the rumble of shifting mountains. It was a voice that seemed both hers and not hers, layered with the whispers of countless spirits that had chosen to speak through her. Each word rolled like thunder, striking the hearts of the guilty and sending waves of unease across the crowd. "You mocked silence," she spoke, her voice carrying across the square. But silence was never weakness. Silence was the earth listening, waiting, and remembering. The guilty men who had raised their hands against her staggered backward, their faces pale. The very ground beneath their feet quivered faintly, a warning that their time of power was ending. The women who had once turned away from her suffering now wept openly, feeling the weight of their complicity. And the children, who had been taught to laugh at her, hid behind their mother's legs, their wide eyes fixed on the girl who no longer seemed merely human. Her transformation continued before their eyes. The dust of the earth lifted around her like a cloak, wrapping her shoulders in a mantle of strength. The wounds that had been inflicted on her body glowed faintly, no longer marks of pain but signs of endurance, shining like sacred scars that testified to her suffering and survival. In her gaze there was no hatred, only an unshakable force, justice itself embodied in her rebirth. Some villagers tried to kneel, thinking submission would shield them from her wrath, but the girl raised her hand and the motion froze them in place. "The earth has no need of false bows," her voice thundered. "It answers to truth alone." The guilty men clutched at their throats as if unseen roots pressed against their skin. Their breaths grew short, their hearts heavy, for they felt the ground beneath them harden, rejecting their weight. Terror twisted their faces as they realized that the very soil, the foundation of their homes and their lives, no longer wished to hold them. But even in her newfound power, the girl's spirit shone with a balance of mercy. She did not strike them down in rage, though the earth itself longed to. Instead, she stood radiant, her form glowing brighter with every passing moment, and declared, "You shall feel the weight you gave me. You shall walk as if carrying stones, speak as if swallowing dust, and remember that cruelty sows curses deeper than roots." A wail erupted among the cruelest of the villagers, for already they felt it, the heaviness in their bones, the dryness in their throats, the slow rejection of the world they had once believed belonged to them. Their punishment was not quick, it was enduring, a reminder carved into their lives. Meanwhile, those who had shown her even the smallest kindness, the old woman who had once given her a crust of bread, the child who had smiled at her when no one else did, felt a strange warmth in their hearts. It was as if the earth itself recognized their goodness and shielded them from the storm of judgment. The girl, now transformed, lifted her hands and the wind responded. It swirled around her hair, carrying its earthen shimmer like sparks across the air. The sun broke through the clouds, casting its light fully upon her radiant skin, making her seem like a figure of both soil and sky, bound in harmony. Her silence had been her strength, but her voice, this new earth-born voice, was her power. And with it she declared not only judgment but renewal. "The earth remembers," she said, her tone softer now, though still laced with that mountain-deep resonance. "And so must you. Let this village be reborn not in cruelty but in truth. Let no hand rise in violence without the earth itself rising in answer." As her words sank into the hearts of all who heard, even the air seemed to grow lighter, charged with a promise that nothing in their world would ever remain the same. The girl was no longer just a victim, nor merely a survivor, she had become a vessel of the earth's strength, transformed into something eternal. And from that moment onward, no one would dare mock her silence again. The villagers who had once raised their hands against her now found themselves shivering under the weight of her gaze. She did not need to shout or curse, the earth itself had become her judgment. Wherever she looked, the ground seemed to answer, shifting in silence, responding to her grief and her newborn strength. It was as though the soil had decided who was guilty and who was pure, and it would not be swayed by words or false repentance. The wicked ones who had beaten her felt the first sting of consequence in their homes. Crops that had once thrived under their care now withered overnight. Stalks of millet bent and collapsed as if heavy with shame. Beans shriveled before reaching maturity. Even the water stored in their pots turned stale, carrying the bitter taste of decay. They tried to save their harvests, but the ground rejected their hands. No matter how much they dug, watered, or pleaded, the soil hardened against them, refusing to yield. Meanwhile, in the homes of those who had pitied her silently, or those who had turned away but not raised their hands, life still stirred. Their crops bent under the weight of abundance, fruits swelled with sweetness, and the soil softened to welcome their touch. It became clear that the earth itself was dividing the people, marking out the guilty from the innocent. Panic spread like fire through the guilty ones. "She has cursed us," they whispered to one another. Yet deep in their hearts, they knew it was not a curse but a balance restored. For had they not struck her without mercy? Had they not laughed while she bled, treating her as though her life was worth nothing? Now, the same soil that had soaked up her blood turned against them, and there was no hiding from its truth. The men who had lifted stones against her felt the weight of those stones in their own bodies. Their arms grew stiff, their shoulders heavy as though the ground had seeped into their bones. They struggled to lift even a basket of grain, stumbling under burdens they once carried with ease. Their wives, who had mocked her cries, found their cooking fires dimming no matter how much wood they added, the smoke curling back to sting their eyes. Even their children refused to sleep peacefully, tossing and crying as if the spirits themselves whispered warnings in their ears. One night, as the guilty gathered in fear, the earth itself answered with a deep groan that shook their huts. Roofs trembled, dust fell from walls, and the ground split just enough to make them fall to their knees. They cried out in terror, but when they looked toward her dwelling, they saw her standing calmly, her feet glowing against the soil. Where she stood, grass burst into sudden bloom, and flowers rose as if eager to greet her presence. It was undeniable now, wherever she stepped, life followed. The path behind her was lined with blossoms, the air filled with the sweet scent of renewal. Birds circled above her, their calls ringing like chants of praise. The very wind seemed to soften when it passed her, wrapping her in a cloak of honor. Children who had been hungry followed her, and she shared with them fruits that sprang from the ground at her command. The elders of the village trembled. They gathered to speak, their voices low with dread. "This girl has become the hand of the earth," one said. "She is the judgment we cannot escape." Another whispered, "Perhaps we must kneel before her, or the soil will bury us alive." But even as they spoke, none dared to approach her without shaking, for her presence revealed their guilt more loudly than any accusation. Some among the guilty tried to flee, thinking that distance would save them. They left the village, carrying what little they could, but the earth followed. Wherever they stepped, the ground cracked beneath their feet, water dried in their gourds, and hunger gnawed at them without end. The earth had chosen sides, and it would not let them escape. In contrast, those who sought her forgiveness found a different fate. A widow who had once turned her face away from the beating in fear, came trembling with a gourd of water and placed it before her. The girl smiled softly, and when she touched the gourd, the water within turned cool and sweet. The widow's field, which had been barren for seasons, bloomed the next day with fresh shoots of grain. From that moment, the people understood. Forgiveness could open the soil again, but only if it came from the girl herself, the one chosen by the earth. The balance of power had shifted. No longer was she the one beaten, mocked, and left to die. She was the living voice of the land, the walking judgment that separated life from decay. The villagers began to whisper her name with reverence, some with fear, some with awe. Children ran to her not with pity but with joy, gathering the fruits and flowers that appeared wherever she walked. Old women touched the ground she had stood on, hoping the soil would pass its blessings to their frail bodies. But for the guilty who had shed her blood, there was no peace. They became shadows in their own homes, unable to rest, unable to reap, unable to smile. They felt the earth pressing against them at every step, reminding them of what they had done. And each time they saw her, radiant and unbroken, they were forced to bow their heads, for her very presence exposed their shame. Thus the earth carried out its judgment, not through fire or sword but through balance. Life to the innocent, abundance to the kind, and desolation to the cruel. And in the center of it all stood the girl they had tried to destroy, now the embodiment of justice itself. The years that followed her transformation were unlike anything the villages had ever known. Once a girl trampled and mocked, she now stood as a living reminder that the earth itself carries memory, that the soil beneath their feet does not sleep but breathes and listens. Her life blossomed in ways that startled both friend and enemy alike. Where others expected her to be broken or bitter, she thrived. She built a small hut on the edge of the fertile fields that now followed her footsteps, and it became more than a home. It became a place where the weary, the outcast, and the forgotten sought refuge. Her hands, once calloused by cruelty, grew tender with healing. People whispered that when she touched seeds, they sprouted faster, and when she laid her palms on the sick, their fever broke as if the earth's cool breath had kissed them. Her presence became a beacon not just of strength but of justice. Children who had once been told to avoid her now sat at her feet, listening to her speak of patience, resilience, and the secrets of the soil. Mothers came to her with prayers for fertility, asking her to bless their wombs with the same life she had coaxed from the barren ground. Farmers left tokens of gratitude at her doorstep, baskets of grain, jars of honey, clay pots of water, because they believed that in giving to her they gave back to the earth itself. Yet, her story was not remembered only for the blessings she carried. It was remembered for the judgment that had fallen upon those who wronged her. In whispers passed from hearth to hearth, the villagers spoke of how the cruel ones lost their wealth, how their granaries turned hollow, how even their children feared the dark because they felt unseen hands tugging at their ankles. They remembered the way their feet had grown heavy, their steps uncertain, as if the land itself no longer wished to carry them. It was said that no matter how much they tried to plant, their fields remained dry, but in the soil touched by her presence, vines thickened, trees bore fruit, and streams ran clear. This duality, her grace and the earth's vengeance, became the backbone of her legend. Elders, when scolding children who mocked the weak, would point to her tale and say, "Do not strike the innocent, for the earth remembers what your hands forget." At festivals, griots sang her name with drums that echoed like footsteps on the soil, reminding listeners that she was not just a woman but a living covenant between humanity and the ground they walked upon. "The earth does not forget the tears of the innocent," they would chant, their voices rolling like thunder across the villages. Travelers carried her tale beyond her homeland. Merchants retold it in bustling markets, weaving her story between trade and bargaining. Nomads sang it across deserts, reminding tribes that cruelty leaves footprints too deep to hide. Even warriors, hardened by battle, invoked her name before entering conflicts, fearing that unjust bloodshed might summon her unseen wrath. Her story, once local, spread like roots underground, unseen but unbreakable, until it became part of the oral memory of distant lands. But to her the legend was not about power. She did not seek worship or titles. She simply lived, tending to the earth and listening to its whispers, carrying the balance between compassion and justice. When people knelt before her, she lifted them and said, "I am not above you. I am with you. It is the earth that sees. It is the earth that speaks." These words shaped how she was remembered, not as a goddess to be feared, but as a daughter of the soil, a reminder that the ground beneath their feet was alive, recording every act of cruelty and kindness alike. As generations passed, the story deepened. Children grew up learning that their footprints mattered, that their actions left echoes in the soil. They knew that laughter built on someone else's tears would someday turn bitter, and kindness planted would someday return as shade and fruit. Her name became less about one person and more about a truth stitched into the world. No pain is wasted and no injustice goes unseen. When the elders told her tale beneath the moonlight, their voices softened with awe. She was the earth's daughter, they would begin. Beaten but never broken. Mocked but never silenced. The soil clothed her, the wind spoke for her, and the sun bore witness to her tears. From her suffering grew justice, and from her silence rose a voice that will never die. And the children, wide-eyed, would whisper the refrain back, "The earth does not forget the tears of the innocent." Her story became both shield and warning, comfort and caution. For the oppressed, it was a promise that their pain was not invisible. For the wicked, it was a reminder that their cruelty had roots, and those roots would someday choke them. And in the balance of these truths, her legacy endured, carried in every step upon the soil, in every drop of rain that nourished the land, and in every generation that retold the legend of the earth's daughter.